Hey, Rory.
Good morning, Ben.
Good evening.
Good evening.
That's right.
Okay, let's kick off. So good evening to everyone in Australia and good morning to everyone in Europe. There's some of us here in London, some in Romania, some in Perth, some in Melbourne, maybe some in Canberra, I don't know. But good morning to everyone. And thanks very much for joining us at this sort of unusual time for our European Social Survey Australia National University joint seminar. There's a number of years ago, I think maybe 5, 6, even 7 years ago, that Julie Lee from the University of Western Australia first came over to London with Shalom Schwartz and had this idea that maybe it'd be possible to have some kind of replication or partner study of ESS in Australia. And then I came over and sort of did a bit of a whirlwind tour from sort of Perth to Brisbane, Brisbane to Sydney, Sydney to Canberra, Canberra to Melbourne, and then back to Perth. And we found our great partners in Canberra at Australian National University, and many thanks to Matthew Gray and Ben Edwards in particular for agreeing to this partnership and to have some ESS questions on their wonderful Living in Australia panel. We're really delighted to have this link. We have a few other global links that we've established, both with surveys in South Africa, most recently in Korea, and we're hoping to have some more developments with other surveys there. We have one also with Japan. And we're also at the moment in negotiations with General Social Survey in USA about a possible MOU. So it's an exciting time for those links. Ben, I don't know if there's any sort of some introductory words you'd like to add before we kick off with the seminar.
Just to say thank you for the kind words, Rory, and it's been great to collect the data and to be able to use the data. And we'll talk more about in a minute about how well used we've used, how important the data has been during the pandemic for Australia. Yeah, thank you, and looking forward to the seminar.
Thank you very much. Well, without further ado, let's kick off to the first paper, which is actually going to be given by Nicholas Biddle and Ben Edwards themselves. So over to you guys.
So Nick and I have been working with the data for a long time, and we wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the sort of key measures in the ESS that we've been using in the Australian context, so social trust, social contact, and income adequacy. So Nick's a professor and associate director at the Centre for Social Research and Methods. I'm a professor at the CSRM as well. What we're going to do first is just talk a little bit about Aussies, which is what we're calling ESS in Australia. Talk a little bit about how another data sets that we're using in the presentation, which is sort of a COVID specific type data set, and how we've linked this data and what the implications of that might be. And then Nick's going to talk about some analysis that we've been doing using the longitudinal online probability panel, Life in Australia. So the ANU has partners with the Social Research Centre, and the Social Research Centre has a probability-based panel called Life in Australia, which is at the time had around 4,000 participants. It's a nationally representative and the only nationally representative probability panel in Australia. And we use this data resource to collect ESS data. A little bit about the panel. It's a random probability panel that covers both online and offline population. So it has CADI as the offline way in which the data is collected, and obviously web online. The main fieldwork was conducted between the 17th of February to the 2nd of March. So the data is collected very quickly, and we had a pretty good completion rate, even though it was a relatively long survey for this type of panel. We fielded questions from the ESS round 9 in the panel, and in terms of the modules and what was included, many of the core modules were included in the panel. So media and social trust politics, a selection from the subjective well-being, social exclusion, religion, national and ethnic identity, as well from timing of life, background variables, some questions from the justice and fairness module. And all the data is publicly available and downloadable from the Australian Data Archive. The key questions that we focused on today for our analysis are 3 social trust measures. So generally speaking, would you say most people can be trusted, or you can't be too careful dealing with people? You think most people would try to take advantage of you if you've got the chance, or would they try to be fair? And would you say that most of the time people are trying to be helpful, or are they mostly looking out for themselves? So that was the social trust measure. The social contact measure, which is particularly relevant if we're thinking about the pandemic, was how often do you meet socially with friends, relatives, or colleagues? Never through to every day. And then finally, a measure of income adequacy, which we create a dichotomous variable from. Which of the following descriptions comes closest to how you feel about your household income nowadays? Living comfortably on a present income, coping on present income, finding it difficult, or finding it very difficult on the present income. So just a little bit about COVID-19 in Australia, because we're going to be focusing on that. So one of the important points to note with Aussies is that it happened just before the onset of the pandemic, and it was very important for our centre, but also more broadly, because it enabled us to have a really good baseline of where the Australian population was at the time. And consequently, we've been able to track how Australian people have been going throughout the pandemic. And so in terms of the number of cases, so this is the daily new confirmed cases per million people with the 7-day rolling average, comparing Germany, UK, Australia, and the USA and the United Kingdom. And you can see Australia is the light blue line, and throughout most of 2020 and up until towards the end of 2021, it's a very flat line and then a very large spike. So we had virtually no cases of COVID-19, or very low rates, and then a big spike with the Omicron virus. This is quite different to the pattern that we see in other countries, and it's relevant when we're interpreting the data. I want to talk a little bit about the Oxford COVID-19 Government Response Tracker, which we've linked to the ESS data, but also to the ANU poll data, the ANU COVID monitoring data. So this is an Oxford University initiative, usually used to compare countries, so as a cross-national comparison, and it provides daily data in more than 180 countries. In Australia, we've been collecting subnational data, so variation between states and territories on a daily basis from the beginning of the pandemic. And it's quite rich information that enables you to look at policy responses and variation in levels of policy stringency in response to the pandemic. And if you recall on the previous slide, there was very low rates of COVID-19 in the population, but very high, relatively high rates of policy stringency in response to the pandemic. So one of the indicators from the Oxford Tracker is a stringency index, which is a composite measure based on 9 responses, which includes things like school closures, workplace closures, stay-at-home orders, which are traditionally referred to as lockdowns, and travel bans. And they're scaled everywhere across every country from 0 to 100, with the 100 being the strictest. So you can see that many countries followed the same sort of pattern, and Australia followed the same sort of pattern as many countries, even though it had relatively low rates of COVID transmission. In terms of the subnational data, I guess the key point here is that there's variation both between states, but also between the major capital city and the rest of the state, largely because there was a lot of variation, a lot more stricter policies in the capital cities of the 2 major states, both Sydney, New South Wales and Victoria, and the major cities, Sydney and Melbourne in Australia. And it's a volunteer process, so there's a structured coding frame and policy coding frame. We had over 50 volunteers volunteer over the course of the pandemic, coding policies on a daily basis. And what we can see here is some variation in the stringency, the level of stringency. Again, it's a 0 to 100 scale. So we can directly compare the experiences in the UK to a state in Australia. And there's a few key points to note. The first is that Victoria in particular, and also New South Wales, had the highest levels of stringency over the course of the pandemic. ACT was sort of the Australian Capital Territory, where Canberra is located, our capital, also had relatively high rates that followed New South Wales, because they have a border that closely aligns. And then many of the other states, after the initial onset of the pandemic, where there was relatively high rates of policy stringency, had quite relaxed rates. So quite a deal of variation over time, even so, but quite big differences between the different states in terms of level of policy stringency. So and so the data is linked at the individual level, and it's linked at the date time period. So there's variation between individuals, even within the one wave, depending on when they completed the survey. So now I'm going to hand over to Nick, who is going to tell you about some of the outcomes.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So if you wanted to jump on to the next slide, Ben. So as Ben mentioned, I'll just really quickly give a little bit more details about the Life in Australia survey, which the Life in Australia panel, which we ran the Aussie on. So I think Ben's kind of covered most of this. What he didn't mention, though, and what I think is quite important is that since February 2020, when we ran the version of the ESS, we've essentially followed the same individuals through time as part of the longitudinal component. And our most recent survey just came out of the field, and we're just putting together our first publication from the January 2023 survey. So as you can see here, we had quite similar kind of wave completion rates, around 80% in January 2023, and a sample of about a little over, or close to 3,500 Australians. Another thing to note is that it's an English-speaking survey, so it's all kind of either interviews or questionnaires are in English, and that obviously influences a little bit the ability of non-English speaking Australians to complete the survey. And also just a kind of a final thing to note, it's not on the slide here, but Ben did mention that we have kind of an offline component, but even since the ESS, that's declined quite substantially. So we're now down to about 3% of people who complete the survey over the phone, with the vast majority completing it online. So if you go to the next slide, Ben, this slide gives the surveys which we've undertaken using the panel, both just prior to the ESS, and then the waves of data collection since. So for those, so Ben mentioned that the ESS took place just prior to COVID in Australia. The other thing to note is that the survey took place during what came to be known as the Black Summer bushfires, which were it's, at least in terms of spread across the country, the most severe bushfires which we've had kind of in living memory. So our pre-COVID waves of data, both January 2020 when we undertook a bushfire survey, and then February 2020 when we undertook the ESS, were affected not only they're affected by other kind of external shocks, and in particular a set of fires which particularly the Commonwealth government, our federal government, was held reasonably negative views towards with regards to the handling of the fires. So January 2020, we do our bushfire survey. February 2020, we run the ESS, and we expect to have a very leisurely couple of months to then analyze the data in a very stable environment. And of course, that didn't happen. The pandemic kind of reached Australia not long after our ESS survey. So we very rapidly transitioned from running a kind of a traditional kind of social survey where we ask kind of rotating modules across waves to essentially running a COVID-19 impact monitoring survey. So we've undertaken 14 impact monitoring surveys specifically focused on COVID, but also having a range of other questions as well. And then you'll see the kind of fourth from bottom row, the CSES, which is a comparative study of electoral systems. So we had an election in May of 22nd of May in Australia, and then essentially the day after, we're in the field collecting our post-election survey. And as you can see, we take January 2020 as a baseline for some of our measures, and February 2020 as a baseline for others. And you can see that we have a reasonably good retention rate from our baseline surveys. So even, Ben, you went too far. If you go back, Ben. Yeah, so even by our most recent survey in January of this year, we're still getting about 61% of our sample having done our first baseline survey. So we've got good longitudinal data, but we can also use it for repeated cross sections. So Ben, if you go to the next slide, I'll give you kind of some figures from key measures from the ESS, which we ended up kind of following and tracking through time. So I would like to think that this was kind of pre-planned and kind of well thought through, but the reality is that the pandemic hit, and we had to very quickly kind of make decisions about what measures we'll track through time, including from our January and our February survey. So one of the measures we used, as Ben mentioned, was the extent to which people were finding it hard, difficult or very difficult to get by on their current income. So the first line, the first dot here, and the whiskers of standard errors, was our pre-COVID baseline from the ESS. And I have to say that this was one of the measures where our priors were completely wrong. So despite the very strong restrictions which Ben talked about, which were essentially across all of Australia in April and May of 2020, and then through to August in parts of the country, our measures of financial distress declined up until November 2020. So, and the main reason for that, which I think is similar in other countries, but certainly was not something which we predicted, was while the government was quite active in supporting incomes in Australia, like in some other countries, the ability to expenditure opportunities stayed depressed for much of 2020. So people couldn't go out, people couldn't spend money, even goods, there was a kind of a supply constraints on goods as well. So while we found that income declined in Australia even after the government intervention, measures of financial distress also declined post ESS. There was then an increase between November 2020 and January 2021, which is essentially when the government removed the main income support payments, which was a boost to the unemployment rate or unemployment income support, as well as a removal of kind of wage subsidies. And then we've had some fluctuations, but a steady increase in financial stress over the 2 years since, with financial stress now higher than it was pre-COVID. And like in many countries, this is mainly a consequence of the relatively high inflation rates, which has led to prices rising faster than most people's wages and earnings. The next slide, Ben. This is another measure which we didn't expect really to have been that much of a focus of our analysis until the pandemic hit. But fortunately, we had a kind of a frequency of social interaction measure from the ESS. So this bar gives the range from never meeting friends and family to on the left-hand side to meeting every day. And in February 2020, our distribution was quite similar to other countries and historic patterns. Then during the height of the lockdown period, which were essentially across Australia in April 2020, that increased to about half of Australians never meeting friends or families outside their household. There was then a decline into May and then again into November, but there has been some fluctuation through time. So October 2021, where was a slight increase again, was when New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT were in what was for us our second lockdown, and what was for Ben his 97th lockdown, or at least that may have been how it felt. But certainly Victoria had experienced multiple lockdowns and was in probably the third major lockdown during that time period. But the point, another important point to note, is that even by August 2022, when those stringency measures were essentially back to baseline, people were still having lower levels of social interaction than they were in our pre-COVID baseline. So if you look at the never, it was almost double. And then the less than once a month was about a little over 50% higher than in February 2020. So like a lot of countries, elevated levels of social isolation since essentially the end of the COVID period. So we didn't ask this question every wave, but we have quite a number of repeated observations, and in some points in time when all of Australia was in lockdown, in other points in time when some of Australia was and other parts weren't. If you go to the next slide, Ben, this gives changes in measures of social trust over the period. So Ben kind of introduced the three questions which were asked, and then we've just taken the average of those three to get a reasonably crude measure of social trust, but one which is highly correlated with a number of other kind of trust measures, but also which, as you can see, has varied quite substantially over the COVID period. So February 2020 is our baseline, once again from the ESS. Like a lot of countries, there was kind of improvements in trust early on in the pandemic. Most other countries have returned, or many other countries have returned to closer to baseline, whereas in Australia, even up until April 2022, just prior to our election, social trust was still higher, significantly higher than it was pre-COVID. And our plan is to replicate this module in our April 2023 survey to see how that's kind of continued through time. So these are just kind of three really important, or three measures which we think are important, which we only have because of the February 2020 ESS, and which we're able to track with different levels of frequency during the COVID period. There's others, so we didn't tend to ask about household income, but we did in the ESS, and we've asked about that every wave. We didn't ask about employment more than once a year, but we asked about it in hours worked. We asked about that in February, and we tracked that through time. So I'll get to a little bit in what some of the how some of these measures have kind of compared to the stringency measure which Ben has been leading the development of. But the other thing I wanted to just introduce is how we've used some of the ESS measures to explain vaccine uptake in Australia. So if you go to the next slide, Ben. So this slide essentially looks at our first wave of COVID-19 vaccine questions, where essentially it's it was in August, I think August of 2020. Essentially, if a safe and effective vaccine was to be developed, people's level of willingness or hesitancy to get vaccinated. So we've done a range of analysis with our vaccine uptake. We've followed these individuals and looked at whether initial hesitancy has predicted actual vaccine uptake. We've looked at booster uptake, and we've also looked at how kind of vaccine uptake has related to a COVID-19 experience. Not quite a vaccine effectiveness study. That's not really what the social surveys are designed for. But one of the things we've looked at is whether one of the reasons why people may have delayed getting a booster is because of their COVID-19 infection, and our survey was the only kind of data set in Australia which has allowed us to do that analysis. But going right back to the point in time when we didn't even know whether vaccines were going to be available, we analysed how some of these factors were some kind of both ESS and other measures were associated with vaccine uptake. So Ben will just, if you go to the next slide, Ben, it just summarizes kind of the main findings and just descriptively. So we essentially run an additive model. First, we start with basic demographics. Then we add some socioeconomics. Then we add some attitudinal measures, and finally we add some health behavior measures. And the relevant ones really are the blue, or many of the blue variables, because they're ones which were only included or only available for our analysis because they're included in the February 2020 ESS. So we were able to show, for example, that people who had relatively high levels of altruism had no association with vaccine hesitancy. So that's in that middle column there, which was not our priors were that it was going to have a stronger association than it did. Some of the red variables on the right-hand side, and also on the left-hand side, I should mention, were also collected in the ESS, and we found that people who didn't have sick leave or protection from their work were less likely to say they'll get vaccinated, whereas the employed, and that was probably to do with the concerns about kind of side effects, whereas the employed and those with high income were more likely to get vaccinated. But the key finding, I think, from to kind of highlight the benefit to us of the ESS and the insights we've got from it, is that many of our trust measures have been strongly associated here with vaccine willingness and hesitancy, but as we've followed these people through time with actual vaccine uptake. So people who think that others are helpful or fair, that kind of trust measure was strongly predictive of a kind of vaccine willingness in kind of mid 2020, and then actual vaccine uptake, as well as willingness as the vaccine rollout took place. We also had some kind of confidence in government measures, which were not asked as part of the ESS, but were asked in our January survey, which were also predictive of vaccine uptake. And in particular, if you're confident in the state and territory government, which tends to, which historically and during COVID administered a health policy that was strongly associated with vaccine uptake. So ESS really helpful, really informative for what was in Australia, like in many countries, the key public policy question of the last couple of years, which is who's going to get vaccinated, who did get vaccinated, and what are some of the reasons for that hesitancy. So Ben, if you go to the next slide, so the next thing I wanted to summarize was how we've used and tracked some of these measures from the ESS and tried to understand how a kind of policy variation in Australia is predictive of kind of well-being measures. So we've used our financial stress measures, but we've also used a few other well-being and well-being measures, linked them at the individual level to the stringency at the point in time when they undertook that survey in that particular region. So if you just go to the next slide, Ben, here are a couple, I think I've just got 4 slides here, which summarize aggregate level measures of well-being and then aggregate kind of stringency values. So essentially each dot is a region in Australia. So either a capital city, non-capital city, by state or territory. And we observe those over multiple periods of time. So the horizontal axis gives that stringency value, ranging in theory from 0 to 100, but over the COVID period from essentially a little over 20 to close to 95. And you can see, not surprisingly, that at the aggregate level, there's a strong negative association with policy stringency and well-being. So as there are greater restrictions in that region, well-being, life satisfaction goes down. If you go to the next slide, Ben, somewhat surprisingly, the next 2 slides kind of show that confidence in government had quite a complex relationship with our stringency measures at the aggregate level. So as stringency goes up, as the restrictions for that particular state and particular region within that state go up, confidence in the federal government increases. So the federal government kind of has responsibility for borders and for kind of income support payments and also for kind of broader kind of messaging and public policy. But then if you go to the next slide, we can see that there's a slight negative relationship with confidence in state and territory governments, who are responsible for public health, and particular responsible for internal borders. So for the first time since 1918, since the or 1919, sorry, since the influenza pandemic internal borders within Australia were closed. And at the aggregate level, you can see that that was negatively associated with a kind of confidence in government. It looks quite weak, but when we look at the individual level, the relationship becomes a little bit stronger, particularly when we control for some other variables, which I'll get to in a little bit. Next slide, Ben. And finally, you can see a relatively weak association between our stringency measure and our one of our ESS measures, which is the essentially whether someone's finding it difficult on their current income. So as the stringency goes up, financial stress goes up a little bit, but the relationship is reasonably weak. And the reason why it's reasonably weak, as mentioned, is because there's kind of those two competing kind of tensions. One is that income opportunities go down, but the other is that expenditure opportunities also go down. And you can see with this data that they kind of move in the opposite direction. So if you go to the next slide, Ben, we can do more with this data when we look at individual level. So the previous slides were essentially aggregate measures. When we look at individual measures, we can really see how people's measures of well-being change through time, whether it be financial stress or life satisfaction, confidence in government, how that related to stringency measures, as well as how that varied across other explanatory variables. So age, sex, Indigenous status, country of birth, language spoken at home, education levels, as well as the level of disadvantage in the area which you live. So essentially our question were our two questions which motivated this presentation or this part of the presentation was how did the financial stress measures vary across COVID-19 policy, and then how does those financial stress measures then relate to other measures of well-being. And so we use a random effects. It's fine, Ben, you can stay on this one. We use a random effects model, which allows us to control for some time invariant, unobserved time invariant characteristics, as well as time varying and time invariant observed characteristics. So what do we find? Essentially, we found a weak but still positive association between the number of COVID-19 cases in the area and the number and the level of stringency in the area and financial stress. So on balance, even though at a national level, there was a drop in financial stress during the most strict, the strongest stay-at-home restrictions. When you look at variation across the states and territories and through time, on balance, there was still a slight positive relationship between stringency and the number of cases in the area and someone's financial stress. We were also able to see who experienced the greatest level of financial stress, even when we control for the area level cases and stringency measures. So females in Australia reported a greater level of financial stress. Those in the lower to middle part of the age distribution, younger Australians, 18 to 24, had lower levels of financial stress, and those 55 years and over had even lower levels of financial stress still. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, which for those who are familiar with the history and the kind of current social setting in Australia, have historically had relatively high levels of disadvantage that was exacerbated during the COVID period, as was disadvantage due to language spoken at home. Those with low levels of education also had a high level of financial stress, as did those who lived in relatively disadvantaged areas. So we can see kind of on balance what the impact was of COVID-19 policies, but also who was impacted the most. And finally, we also find that there was a very strong association between stringency and life satisfaction, as well as the patterns I mentioned before with regards to confidence in institutions, but also that financial stress was one of the drivers, at least at the individual level, of variation in those measures. And it's only really by combining our area level measures with our survey data and also the survey data which started from the ESS, we're able to put some bounds around these measures, as well as to get a sense of what, in net terms, were some of the impacts of COVID-19 policies in Australia. So I think our final slide is next. If you're on the next one, Ben. So just in summary, this is really just a taste of what we've been able to do with our ESS and our impact monitoring survey. I should note that Ben mentioned that the ESS is available in our data archive, which is very similar to the UK data archive, but our longitudinal data is also available. So including ESS measures. So if we've asked the question multiple times from the ESS, or if that measure from the ESS has been found to be strongly predictive of outcomes over the COVID period, then it's available in a individual level longitudinal data set for any approved researchers to download and analyze. Our plan is to run the ESS again, essentially as a bookend to, now being a little bit ambitious here, a bookend to COVID-19, and just because we say it's the end of COVID-19 doesn't make it so, but we'll make comparisons obviously with both the pre and the end of the COVID as well as the in-between. And finally, there's an opportunity, and Ben might kind of pick it up from here, to look in more detail at the within the restriction, not just kind of our overall summary measure, but also kind of the types of restrictions and how that impacted on some of our ESS measures and other measures as well. So Ben, if you want to finish off with any other final points, and then we'll hand it back to you, Rory.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, so not much more to say from me, except that the Aussies has been really quite instrumental and important in terms of the COVID monitoring. And something that Nick didn't say, but it's important to note, is that some of the work and some of the data that was collected in Aussies that served as the baseline for the COVID monitoring measures was actually cited by our previous Prime Minister in Parliament when discussing motivation towards providing additional income support and the benefits of that to the Australian people. So both in terms of vaccinations and also in terms of measures of income support, the sorts of data that we've been able to collect has been really important. So we are very grateful that we have collected that ESS data, and we're really looking forward to be able to do it again. And as Nick said, bookend, hopefully, the end of the pandemic. So that would be a really nice way to finish. So I'm just going to stop sharing. And
thank you, Ben. Thank you, Nick. Fascinating presentation. If people have got questions, if they want to post them in the Q&A, we can pick those up in a minute. And just while people are considering their questions and typing them in, I've got one observation actually, and then one question. One observation is your presentation really highlights that there is I think a gap in Europe at the moment in terms of data collection. Of course, you were able to ask ESS questions and then you were able to repeat them throughout the pandemic, whereas Europe was, with a few exceptions, was largely left with having asked the questions just before the pandemic and then having a very long gap where face-to-face data collection wasn't possible and not having any data. And there were some exceptions like UK NatSen panel or the Corona study, in the Mannheim Corona study, and the LIST panel, of course, in the Netherlands. There were exceptions, but many countries, of course, had no access to the kind of data that you've been presenting, and it's a case we've been making for some time that Europe really needs something on these lines for itself.
So a couple of things to note on that. One is that I guess a side point is that we found that our response rates increased substantially during the early part of the pandemic. So you kind of mentioned some of the challenges of face-to-face data collection, and we found that with online data collection, supplemented by telephone, that people were really willing, like we've seen in a lot of other countries and a lot of other contexts, people were really willing to engage and give responses, partly because, what else were they doing, but also because they saw the value of the data from a public policy perspective. And I think the other point to note is that we were, and we should have said this up front, we're really fortunate that early on we got support from our Commonwealth government, and in particular the Institute of Health and Welfare, which is a government agency, to be able to continue our data collection. So it was not, while ANU kind of funded some of our surveys, there was no way we could have done that without that external support. And I think that's governments in Australia have belatedly, I think, seen some of the benefits of kind of supporting this type of infrastructure. But another point is that we're not for having done the ESS and also some of our other ANU polls beforehand. Who knows? Like our financial stress measure, we would have known what the baseline was. We wouldn't have known what social interaction was pre-COVID. So it was fortunate having had that data prior, but also fortunate to have a government, or at least a public service, which was really invested in kind of data collection.
I just want to add one point, which I think is a really important point, and then we can throw up to questions, Rory, which is also the rapidity in which you can deploy these sorts of surveys, and the flexibility and responsiveness. So we're in situations where we were reporting on vaccine intentions, but also in terms of levels of vaccination, faster than the government was actually being able to process their administrative data. And of course, the administrative data didn't have the same level of detail and quality and sort of measures that that is in some of the survey data. So there's a real argument for this investment in infrastructure and how it pays off.
Absolutely. I think this really highlights it very nicely. Just one other question from my side before we go. There's a couple of questions we'll go to then. I think you mentioned, Ben, at the beginning that the proportion of people now taking part via telephone has sort of decreased. I was just wondering, is that because you're still getting the same kind of response rate, but more people have shifted to doing it online, or is it because
exactly
people on the telephone are harder to reach now?
No. So essentially, we the SRC who administers the survey, you can opt to do it online or over the phone, and anyone who wants to do it over the phone can do it over the phone. But as people, the longer someone's in the panel, the more comfortable they become doing the survey online. And it's not just that it's not just that kind of people are becoming more comfortable online in general. Even if you kind of at a particular point in time, the length of time in the survey matters, not just kind of what time it is. So it kind of shows that the far from it being a something which people find more burdensome, people do find it easier. We've done some kind of mode effects testing, and we're pretty confident that it doesn't, to the best of our ability, it doesn't seem to be a kind of skewing results either. So it's a choice by our respondents essentially.
Excellent, very interesting. Okay, we've got a few questions. The first is, how was the policy stringency measure calculated?
That's an excellent question.
Okay.
There is a whole working paper on this, which I can refer you to. There's 9 indicators, and they're ordinal in scale, and then they're basically scaled so that they equally contribute to the overall 0 to 100 scale, but then they're scaled to be a 0 to 100 measure. There are, as I said, 23 indicators in total that are captured in the Oxford tracker, plus variation in the policy stringency by whether you're vaccinated or not, because in many countries there was variation in policy stringency if you were vaccinated or not vaccinated, and the timing of the vaccination and who was eligible also varied over time. So you can sort of tease that out as well, and we've done that as well. So there's no easy answer to your question, but I'll put in the chat a little bit later a link to both the Australian subnational data, but also data working paper, but also the key Nature human behaviour paper, which describes the construction of the scale, the stringency index, and the other indicators.
Thanks, Ben. There's a question from Isabella. Says, if I understand correctly, 60% of the panel individuals are still in 2023. How do you recruit the new interviewees, and do you see some differences between the new population and the older one?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I'll take this one. We do have a small sample refresh at the end of every year, and then a larger refresh every couple of years. So the recruitment is a combination of address-based, SMS push to web, and telephone-based recruitment. Although increasingly SMS push to web is been seen to be the most cost-effective. Even if you get smaller response rates per message compared to an address-based, you still get quite for the cost is much less. And we do obviously see a little bit of panel conditioning. So I don't think we find too many differences kind of conditional on how long you've been in the sample. So essentially you have our new recruits are relatively quite similar to initial recruits based on observables, but we do get a little bit of panel conditioning. So not only do we, as part of that, there's also not only recruitment, but also a retirement of some of our panel members to balance that as best we can. It's not, it's remains a challenge, like with any kind of panel maintenance, to kind of balance that. We know that people have been around for a while tend to be those who fill in surveys, but they also tend to be those who have their kind of responses stop varying as much through time, and we try and balance that as best we can. So we wait, we refresh, we retire, and we just keep an eye on these things as best we can.
Thanks, Nick. There's a question from Daphne. From the data which presented, it looks as if individuals are applying to what are more long-term issues, i.e. like social interactions, with a short-term situation in mind. Is this something that you keep in mind when interpreting the results in general?
Ben, do you want to have a go at this, or do you want me to go first?
So I think from memory, and I'll correct me if I'm wrong, Rory, because you probably know this better than I am, there is a time period stated, I believe, for the social interaction. So I think it's framed in terms of the last month, is it, Nick? I think, or last couple of weeks.
Yes, I can't remember exactly, but yes, it is a time window. Yep. So
that was good from our point of view when we're looking to track interactions over time, and I think if you were to frame it just without that context, then I think it would be very hard for people to recall things. So that was useful for tracking things over time. So it just happened to work out for us in that way.
And I think the other point to note is that so in Australia, we have our household income and labour dynamics in Australia survey, HILDA, which is, well, what's the UK equivalent, Ben? I always forget the difference.
Understanding
PSID
Society.
Understanding Society, yep. And it's a wonderful survey. We release it through the data archive, but it only happens once a year. So there was one survey in the end of kind of 2020, and then we've been repeated it's a yearly survey. Whereas our data, we can see those within year fluctuations. And I didn't put it up, but our life satisfaction measure varied quite substantially over the period, far more so than it did kind of pre-COVID and in the last couple of waves. So I think these measures are stable during stable periods, but during times of real fluctuation, we can pick that up with our high frequency data collection.
Thanks, Nick. Another question was, how similar is the online and telephone questionnaires? Are they so much adaptation required between the two?
Not a lot, but we tend to, some of our survey experiments, we don't tend to do over the phone. So we, as an example, in October 2022, we ran some survey experiments on people's views on randomized control trials. So an experiment on experiments. But it was quite difficult for people to keep all the information in mind over the phone from our pilot testing. So we dropped some of those for the telephone and only did online. But where and we have some slightly different prompts, but for the most part, the questions are similar.
And last question was about the questions on trust. Is there anything in the data that suggests that you can know a bit more about what individuals are looking for in terms of trust?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So we've got quite a lot of trust measures, and they often move in quite different directions. So, for example, we asked about kind of trusting government regarding data. So we've had a few data breaches, and also, like in the UK, data has become really prominent during COVID-19. And that moved in very different directions to just a generalized trust measure. And then we have different trust in different institutions, which vary quite substantially as well. So in the US, for example, there was a decline in trust in the police, partly due to kind of Black Lives Matter, but also due to kind of COVID. We didn't find that in Australia. We found a kind of trust in police it stayed high and in a sense got higher. And then the final thing which we did is we asked some very specific measures. So they were repeated questions, which I just mentioned, but we asked some very specific ones about trust in specific kind of domains. So we asked about trust with regards to vaccines. What else do we ask about? We've asked about some of our kind of tracking data. So with the QR code check-ins. So we tried to drill into it as best as possible, and had some open-ended questions as well. But I mean, obviously not going to get as good a detail as you would if you had kind of qualitative interviews. But as a survey, I think we were able to to kind of tease out what went up, what went down, who trusted more, who trusted less. Was it generalized trust? Was it trust in institutions? Was it trust in a certain domain, or was it in just trust more broadly?
Fantastic. Thank you both very much for the wonderful presentation and for answering questions. Lots of interest there, and I see Ben's finally put some links into the chat as well for those who are interested in those follow-ups. let's move to our next presentation, which is by Professor Julie Lees and Professor Hester van Herk, cross-national authorship, looking at the human value scale in ESS in Australia and UK and the Netherlands. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you for inviting us to present, and welcome to everyone. It's difficult to say good morning or good afternoon depending on where you're located, but we're here to share some insights about how values and their effects might differ across people from Australia, the Netherlands and the UK. You can see the flag of the Netherlands and Australia included on the slide. I haven't included the UK because the Union Jack is also part of the Australian flag, acknowledging the history of British settlement in Australia. And what I'd like to do is maybe introduce myself very briefly, and also Hester. So I'm a Winthrop Professor, Director of the Centre for Human and Cultural Values and Director of Research and Research Training in the Business School at UWA. And Hester is Professor of Cross-Cultural Marketing Research at VU and Adjunct Senior Research Fellow at UWA. I would also, here we go, like to acknowledge that the University of Western Australia is located on Noongar land and is standing, and they remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs and knowledge. All right, so moving forward with our presentation. I'm first going to provide a brief overview of the samples and the ESS measures that we use in our analysis, and some highlights of the values theory that sits behind the PVQ 21 scale that's in the ESS and was also included in the Australian data collection. I'll then discuss the similarity of the structure of values with the theory and between countries, as well as differences in value importance between countries. After that, Hester's going to introduce differences in beliefs about important societal issues, including trust in institutions, attitudes towards immigrations, gay men and lesbian women across the 3 countries. And then we'll discuss some relations between values and these important societal beliefs in more detail before we give some conclusions. So let's start the presentation. We're comparing Australia, the UK and the Netherlands. Obviously, I'm from Australia and Hester's from the Netherlands. These are large representative samples, courtesy of the ESS and Life in Australia panel, and they're all Western, relatively high GDP countries or high GDP countries, and Australia has especially strong ties to the UK. Our shared history and the common values that we have, or that are often mentioned in media, also underlie the strong links that we have between our societies. Yet there's also a lot of differences. Clearly we're in different parts of the world. So there's differences in geography and climate. There's large differences in population density, in our near neighbours, in the type of threats we face as societies, in the systems we have, including our political, legal and education systems. So the first question is really, do we have shared common beliefs and values among these countries? The ESS measures we include the human values module, and there's an example of an item there. The religiosity item, which measures how religious a person thinks they are. And also questions about trust in institutions. We use 2 items, attitudes towards immigration, 2 items, and attitudes towards gay men and lesbian women, 2 items. We did this in part because there were some difficulties with cross-cultural equivalence, and also it shows some of the insights that we get with individual items. So each round of the ESS has included the value scale developed by Shalom Swartz. For those who aren't familiar, these are personal values that serve as individuals' guiding principles in life. They reflect what matters to the person, what's important, what's worthy and desirable. Societies appear to share common, perhaps universal set of values that are shown in this circle and depicted in Swart's value measures. But people tend to prioritise different parts of this circle or different values, depending on their genetic makeup, their upbringing, their exposure to societal institutions, and the daily experiences they have interacting with the particular types of societal institutions that they personally interact with. This means that people not only differ in values, but there's at least some people who place or prioritise every different value in this system as most important to them. And that leads to really large differences in the guiding principles that people have in life. So very different life goals and motivations that underlie their beliefs, attitudes, and behaviours. These differences can be seen in the trade-offs between values in this circle, which represents the relations among values. So if we look at the two bipolar dimensions that I have on this slide, some people will prioritise tradition, conformity, and security over other values, whereas others will prioritise stimulation, self-direction, and hedonism. You can see that it would be difficult to prioritise both of these things at the same time. So prioritising the more conservative values and prioritising this really strong openness to change at the same time would lead to a motivational conflict. Similarly, some people prioritise other people over themselves. They prioritise the welfare of all people or of their family, and we call these self-enhancement values, whereas others prioritise their own personal success, achievement, and power over other people, and we call these self-enhancement values. I think having an idea of what this circumplex is helps us to understand how the values relate to each other, and this system has been found in most countries in this form, and also within individuals. I want to show you the value structure of the three countries that we're analysing, and just note that the structure, the order of values around the circle, the relations among values are very similar to the theory in these three countries and very similar to each other. So clearly the values are understood in similar ways. And this slide shows you the value means, and these are the centred values, where values that are greater than 0 are more highly prioritised, and those less than 0 are less prioritised. It doesn't mean that they're negative values, because all values are seen as desirable in society. So people tend to evaluate most values as at least somewhat important. So this is the relative difference between values across individuals. When we look at this, it's really noticeable that these three countries share fairly similar value systems. Benevolence tends to be the most important value, and power the least important in these societies. And that's also true pan-culturally across most countries, not all countries though. But also we can see some differences. Noticeably, hedonism is higher in the Netherlands, security is lower in the Netherlands, and conformity is higher for Australia. In fact, there's differences across, significant differences between countries across each value except stimulation. So benevolence is higher in the UK, but equal in Australia and the Netherlands. Universalism is higher in the Netherlands and equal in UK and Australia. Self-direction is, universalism is lower in the Netherlands and higher in the UK and Australia. Self-direction is higher in the Netherlands than UK and Australia. Hedonism is higher in the Netherlands than the UK, and the UK is higher than Australia. Achievement, the UK is lower than Australia and the Netherlands. In power, it's higher for Australia than the Netherlands, than the UK. Security is higher for the UK than Australia and than the Netherlands. Conformity is higher in Australia than the UK, which is higher than the Netherlands, and tradition is higher in the UK than Australia and the Netherlands. That's a really quick summary of what these differences mean. But I think the takeaway is that the patterns are quite similar. The caveat I want to give in this is that these are averages across individuals in the sample. So it can mean that, for instance, benevolence is at least somewhat important for most people, or quite highly important for most people, or extremely important for a smaller section of the population. And so just looking at the means alone doesn't give us as much information as we would like. So looking at how values relate to variables helps us understand a bit more of this. So I'm going to pass it over to Hester to talk about some differences in the societally important beliefs and how values relate to them. And then it'll come back to me at the end for a few more insights. Thank you, Hester.
Thank you, Julie. I will continue with the societal important beliefs and then relate those to the values in several analyses. What we can see on this slide is that there are clear differences between the countries regarding religiosity. That's equal in Australia and the United Kingdom and a bit higher in the Netherlands. And then the next, that's really, I think, a large difference, that is trust in the nation's parliament, which is highest in the Netherlands and equal in the United Kingdom and Australia. Trust in the legal system is overall higher in the three countries in comparison to trust in the nation's parliament. And again, here there's it's the highest in the Netherlands, followed by the United Kingdom, and lowest in Australia. Regarding immigration, obviously it's highest in Australia. Australians think immigration is good for the economy, and it's good also for the national culture. It will enrich it. The United Kingdom is in the middle regarding the economy, and the Dutch population thinks that immigration is less good for the economy. Regarding culture, the most negative are the people in the United Kingdom. Regarding gays and lesbians, being free to live is considered important in all countries. The score is very high. And also what we should note is that in the previous 5 items, they were all measured on 11-point scales going from 0 to 10, whereas the scale for regarding gays and lesbians is on a 5-point scale. So for both items, we can see that people in the 3 countries think very positively about gays and lesbians. So they should be allowed to live free, and people are not ashamed to have a gay or a lesbian person in their family. Julie, can we go to the next slide, please?
Yeah.
On this slide, we relate trust in institutions. Then the institutions are the nation's parliament and the nation's legal system to human values. First, I would like to have a look at nation's parliament on the left-hand side. First is the estimate, this is multiple regression. The intercept indicates 4.48, which shows that across all nations in general, the trust in the nation's parliament is about average, because the score ranges from 0 to 10. Then it's followed by UK and Netherlands, showing that in the Netherlands, trust in the nation's parliament is higher than in Australia, much higher than in Australia, with a coefficient of 1.37. but in the UK it's lower than in Australia. Then when we move to the values, when people consider universalism very important, then the trust in the nation's parliament gets lower, and people who are religious have more trust in the nation's parliament. Then regarding TR Times UK indicates tradition in the UK compared to Australia, which shows that people who are high on tradition values in the UK are more negative on the nation's parliament than people in Australia, and the same holds for people in the Netherlands. And then in the lower part of this table, it shows in the Netherlands, both universalism and religiosity, the main effect across all people is reduced. So actually compared to the rest, which also means that the effect of universalism and religiosity is less important for trust in the nation's parliament in the Netherlands. So actually the main effect is cancelled out in the Netherlands, indicating that UK and Australia are more similar to each other than they are to the Netherlands in regards to trust in the nation's parliament. On the right-hand side, it's the nation's legal system. And what is striking is that the values playing a role in this are totally different from trust in the nation's parliament. So when it's about trust in the legal system, universalism plays a main role. People scoring high on universalism trust the nation's legal system more, and also the religious people trust the nation's legal system more, whereas people considering tradition very important consider the legal are less trustful in the nation's legal system. Again, here regarding the legal issues, trust is higher in the two European countries than in Australia, with the Netherlands being highest. Before we move to the next slide, I would like to mention quickly that in the Netherlands there's a nitrogen crisis at the moment. Many people are not satisfied with the parliament anymore. But in the last ESS wave, they were still very positive about both parliament and legal system. But I would be really interested to see what the next ESF wave will bring us. Julie, can we move on to the next slide, please? Beliefs towards immigrants. The first on the left-hand side is effects on nations' economy. And here we can clearly see that both UK and Netherlands are more negative on the effect of the nation on the economy, with people being more tradition or considering tradition more important, being even more negative towards immigrants, and people who consider universalism important being far more positive on the effects on the economy. And the effect of universalism is interesting in this one on the nation's economy, that people scoring high on universalism in the UK consider even more positive beliefs towards immigrants in their country. And the same holds for religious people. Regarding enrichment of the cultural environment, the results are about similar, with again a very strong positive effect of universalism, negative of tradition, which is strengthened in the UK for people who are very high on tradition, they do not consider that immigrants enrich the country's culture and it's positive. Then I would like to move to the next slide. Attitudes towards gays and lesbians. As I said before, in general, in all three countries, there's a very positive attitude towards gays and lesbians. When we look at the scales, the scores are over 4 on the 5-point scale. The first one is not free to wish as they live. And then that relates to a negative universalism, positive tradition, religiosity. The more traditional people are less positive on gays and lesbians. And that negative and the positive effect of religiosity on being negative is reduced in the UK and the Netherlands, which implies that religious people in Australia are more negative on gays and lesbians to live free as they would like to. And on the right-hand side, being ashamed is universalism, again, very positive. Tradition and religiosity, negative. And in this case, again, in Australia, the effect of religiosity is stronger than negative effect, because in both the Netherlands and UK, it's enhanced a bit. But overall, the attitudes in all situations are quite similar across the three countries, with slight differences when we interact with, for instance, religiosity. And now I would like to hand over to Julie again for the next slide.
Okay, so we had a look at, also had a look using quantile regression. The idea behind this was to try and capture some individual differences. So we've been looking at whether relations between beliefs and values differ depending on how important the belief is to individuals. So these results are across all three countries. The main reason for that is that it's difficult to do the analysis due to sample size. You need quite a large sample size for this. The intercept here shows the mean or the starting point in beliefs about gay and lesbians should be free to live their own lives. And it's broken people into quantiles, which are the proportion of respondents at different levels along the distribution of their beliefs. And we're able to then look at whether or not the relationship between religiosity and values with the belief is different at different points along the distribution. So I think you can probably see my pointer. The middle graph is religiosity. And so this is showing that when people are more negative in their beliefs about, more positive in their beliefs about, I have difficulty with this reverse scale here, but religiosity is more strongly associated with beliefs about gay and lesbians being free to live their own lives when people are more negative about about these beliefs because of the reverse scale. So at higher points along the scale, the relationship is stronger. The relationship's also stronger with conservation at these points, and it's also more negatively stronger with universalism. What this means is that for people who, that there is a fairly large proportion of the population, about 40% in this case, where basically the correlation between beliefs and these variables is 0, which means that the correlations that we can see in this graph, it means both that religiosity and values actually have a stronger relationship with beliefs than we might otherwise think. This is work in progress with the ESS and many personality and belief items, because quantile regression is allowing us to look at differences in groups of people based on their answers to specific questions. So finally, we'll go to the overview in terms of the discussion. So we've looked at value importance across Australia, the UK and the Netherlands, and general patterns are really similar, although there are some differences. In most cases, we find that one country will be slightly stronger on values than another country, but the patterns really are quite similar. The effect of values on beliefs towards Parliament and the legal system were different. Australia and the UK were more similar than Australia was with the Netherlands. The effects on values on beliefs towards immigrants were more similar with Australia and the Netherlands, and traditional people were more negative on immigrants in the UK. Value and belief on gay and lesbians were more similar between Australia and the UK, and the more religious in the UK and the Netherlands are more positive than the more religious in Australia. Is there anything that you'd like to add to this, Hester?
No, I think it's very clear. Yeah, maybe what I said before about the changes. So regarding Parliament, also things that are happening right now with immigration, but I think that holds in general for the ESS.
Thank you, Julie.
You.
Thank you, Hester, for a wonderful presentation. Very interesting. Again, if people want to put questions into the chat, that would be lovely. Just while people are doing that, I had one question for you both. Julie, on I think your last main slide, you mentioned that there was a link between conservation and attitudes to gay men and lesbians and the strength of that. Do you have any sense of why that might be? Or what that's about? It seems a bit surprising almost.
No, well, these are, so because the question was reversed, so people who are more negative to this question, so people who think that who are more negative to the idea that gays and lesbians should live a free life, they tend to be more conservative. So the relationship, but actually it's the relationship between the conservation values and that increase, right? So when people have a stronger belief that gays and lesbians should be able to live life freely, then how conservative they are doesn't matter.
Okay. And is that kind of what you would have expected to find, or does that surprise you a bit?
It is what I would expect, of having done quite a lot of quantile correlation work, in that the stronger the beliefs are, the more positive the stronger the relationships are, and it's over and above mean differences. So when you think about it, you know, if someone increases their conservative values or increases their belief that gays and lesbians should not live freely, right, then we would expect them to have be more conservative.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat. So could you say a little bit more about how the quantiles have been constructed?
Yeah, so quantiles are constructed, they basically line up all the people from along the distribution of beliefs, right, in this case, because the dependent variable is grouped into whatever quantiles you set. So it might be the bottom 20%, the next 20%, the next 20%, the next 20%. And it actually calculates the correlation at that point. So if we're looking, for instance, this case would be, I know it's only a 5-point scale, so we don't have a lot of points in the distribution in this. So there are people who are responding to every point along the distribution, even though on average people are very positive towards gay and lesbian in the survey. And so in the lower quantiles on this, they would be in more agreement to the statement that gay and lesbians should be free. And in the higher quantiles, they're less agreement towards that.
Fantastic. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask Julie and Hester? Are you planning to do to look at any other countries in the ESS? Because obviously you've chosen two that I guess in some ways we might have expected to be a bit more similar to Australia. Have you thought about maybe choosing some other countries? I think that'd be a really interesting maybe next step.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Rory. Because I think the Netherlands and UK, Australia are quite similar. And I think those results will be totally different when we include countries from Southern Europe or countries from Central Europe, like Hungary or Poland, in particular when it's on immigrants and also the legal system. So I think that would be a great next step to do.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And maybe just if there's no other questions, just maybe one more from my side then to Julie. Julie, I know you've sometimes done surveys amongst the Australian population on non-probability samples in the past. Did you notice any differences in the patterns here with a probability sample?
There's differences, but they're not different. There's differences more likely to be attributed to the way values are measured. So we do find quite similar results with most of the data that we've collected when we use the PVQ, which is the specific scales that are in the ESS. In fact, we've just collected data, or not we, but BCW have just collected data in 29 countries, and we compared that with the European Social Survey countries, and it tracked really strongly with that. So it tends to be, I mean, I'm sure there were differences, but they were relatively small differences, honestly.
Fantastic. Well,
I think values tend to probably be one that's a bit more similar, but definitely the beliefs and other questions are quite different.
Okay, so the non-value questions,
Yes.
there's where you spot the differences.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps again suggesting that values is something sort of very consistent, perhaps much more than maybe some of these other attitudinal questions.
Yeah, and they tend to be, the samples I collect are large samples as well. So not that that makes a huge difference if it's non-probability, but it does tend to capture things a little better.
Fantastic. We'll look forward to seeing more as this develops over time. And just to say to both to Ben and Nick, and also to Julie and Hester, we are planning ESS 20-year celebration in 2024, an ESS conference. More details to follow soon. Be lovely to see some of these papers in a session that we're going to have there. Our birthday celebrations were delayed because of COVID. We wanted to have them in person, so please do look out for that. And thank you very much to Hester and Julie for their paper. Let's move to the final paper from this morning from Ruxandra from ESS headquarters. Good morning, Ruxandra, and over to you.
Thank you so much. So I just want to thank very much the other presenters. I think it's been a really interesting morning for me, evening for others probably. And I just want to finish off by comparing some of the variables from the ESS round 9 with data collected in Life in Australia. But just a little bit of background. Basically, the European Social Survey is, as you probably all know, is an academic cross-national survey measuring attitudes and behaviors. To date, we have completed 10 rounds, and we are getting ready for the 11th round right now. In the first 9 rounds, this was a face-to-face survey, so in Europe. And this was basically the methodology that was chosen as the mode of data collection that everyone had to adhere to. But of course, because of the pandemic, in round 10, we had to introduce self-completion methods. And some of the countries collected data in self-completion. To date, we have almost 500,000 interviews completed in the ESS, which is an incredible amount of data. And all of this data is free for non-commercial use. So it can be downloaded from the ESS data portal and is available for anyone to use. From the round 10 data, we have some of the data is already available. There's 19 face-to-face countries and 6 self-completion data. Differently from Life in Australia, we collect self-completion mostly in web and paper. I mean, not mostly, just in web and paper. And so this is just kind of an overview of the rotating modules in the ESS. As you know, we have a core module, and then we have 2 rotating modules in every round. Sometimes they are repeated. In round 10, we had a module on democracy, and then digital contacts in work and family life. In round 9, which is the data that we are comparing the Life in Australia with, is justice and fairness and timing of life. And I think you've seen already in the previous presentations the items that we're including on Life in Australia. So the timing, as I said, timing of life and justice and fairness are the rotating modules for round 9, which was collected in 2018-2019. And just a little bit about the global links, basically the kind of work package that allowed us to have the seminar. Basically, the ESS has been expanding in Europe since 2002 when it started. We now have 32 countries that participated in round 10, but in total there are 39 countries that eventually took part in the ESS. But it has also expanded outside of Europe. As Rory mentioned in the beginning, we have developing our global links, and we're very proud to have this collaboration with Australian National University. And having fielded the ESS questions on Life in Australia, I think, as you've seen today, it gives us a lot of like really important and interesting data that we can look at. As Rory mentioned, we're also in collaboration with NORC and the Japanese and Korean General Social Survey, as well as like the East Asian Social Survey, which encompasses also China and Taiwan, South African social attitude surveys, and so on. So all of these data sets collected outside of Europe are linked on our ESS website. So please have a look at that. They're under the related studies, and there's a wealth of like data there that we can look at and compare with ESS data. So these are the European participating countries in the different rounds. And Australia. So as you've heard today already, the data in Australia was collected in self-completion on web and telephone. It's also random probability sample, and this is a regular survey, which interestingly will allow us to compare even more than we have done so far. So that's really great to have. This is also something that you've seen already today. So the majority of the ESS round 9 questions were filled in on Life in Australia in February, March 2020. So this is right before the pandemic, which is great because the ESS round 9 data is also 2018-2019. So that's pre-pandemic times as well. So this allows us to compare the Australian data with 29 European countries. This is based on a memorandum of understanding that was signed between the ESS and the Australian National University. And this data is now available and linked on our website and on the Australian side of the data as well, so on ADA. So this is important because, well, obviously it allows comparisons with the ESS countries as a whole and individually, and as well as Australia. It's a global snapshot of societal attitudes in a point in time, but also over time. It has the potential for future research collaborations between ESS and the Australian National University, as well as many other institutions that might be interested in this kind of data. Many of the questions fielded form part of the core module on our ESS survey. So they are also included in every round of the ESS, which also will allow comparisons with previous and future rounds of data. So what I'm going to do today is compare the ESS with Life in Australia. And I'll start with like a brief kind of like snapshot of the sample composition. So I'll tell you a little bit about the sample characteristics. Basically, the mode of data collection in Australia was web and telephone, as we've heard, while the ESS round 9 was fully face-to-face. So there's already like a slight difference in how the sample probably looks because of that. But from round 10, we have some data that was collected in self-completion, so that we will have the option of kind of like looking whether there's like some kind of mode differences for those of us who are interested in the methodological side of things. But also just to note that the ESS is also looking to switch to self-completion slowly. So it's very interesting to hear that many of your panelists in Life on Australia are now interested in completing the survey online rather than via telephone, because that, you know, at some point we will be able to look more in depth at these kind of like mode differences. So although there's like a slightly different timeline between the ESS round 9 and the Life in Australia data that we looked at, this is all pre-pandemic data, which you know, it's an interesting kind of like snapshot from life before the pandemic. So the sample composition is quite similar between Australia and the ESS round 9. I will also kind of bring out the UK data, because later in my talk, I will tell you a bit more about comparisons between Australia and the UK. So the sample composition is more or less the same, kind of like any social survey. We have more women than men. But in terms of age, it's interesting to see that the Australian panel is definitely younger than the ESS or the UK sample. And this might have something to do with the fact that it's collected mostly over the web. Also in terms of sample composition, similarly, Australia, UK, and the ESS in general are over 90% citizens of the country where data was collected. But in terms of being born in that particular country, it looks like the ESS is mostly people who are born in that country, but in Australia, it's a little over 70%. So when we are to look at comparing the ESS with Life in Australia, basically, I looked at some comparisons on some of the trust items between Australia, the ESS in general, and some specific countries in the ESS round 9, just to show basically what we can do with the data. I also looked at the happiness, kind of like the well-being measures, so the happiness, life satisfaction, and health. And specifically, I looked at the differences between the UK and Australia on some of these variables. So here is the data on trust in countries' parliament. And this is, it's a very interesting measure, because if we look at the UK and the ESS and Australia, the numbers are quite similar. But if we look at specific country in the ESS, for example, Bulgaria, we see that it's massively different. So although Australia and the UK and the ESS show similar trends in the way this data is distributed across the spectrum, we see that the Bulgarian, for example, data shows definitely like significantly higher level, lower levels of trust in the country's parliament. When it comes to looking specifically, this is another way of looking at the same data. Basically, I broke it down in low, medium, and high trust. So if we look at this particular way of presenting the data, Bulgaria shows much lower levels of trust in their parliament pre-pandemic as compared to ESS, the UK, and Australia. And as you can see on this slide, basically there is no difference, no significant difference between the UK and Australia. Another variable that came up earlier today was trust in legal system and trust in police. And here I'm presenting the data just as low, medium, and high, just so that you can see the differences. So again, I've included the ESS in general for round 9, the UK and Australia, but also specific countries. So for the legal system, I included Germany, which you can see is the levels are very similar to the ones in the UK. And also Spain, which also shows very similar levels in trust in the police as the other contexts. So interestingly, since this data was collected, research shows that the trust in police in general in the UK has plummeted, and this has maybe something to do with all of the scandals, corruptions, and so on that have happened in the past couple of years, but also possibly with the way the pandemic was handled. But from this data, what's interesting to see is that the UK is has slightly higher levels of trust in the legal system and in the police than Australia. Moving on, the other variables that I looked at were trust in politicians and trust in the political parties. And again, I compared the data from Australia, the UK, and the SS, which show quite similar levels of trust in the politicians and political parties. But then I also compare this with some of the Nordic countries that we have data from in the SS round 9, and that is Norway and Iceland. As you can see, the levels of trust in the political system in this kind of like Nordic European countries is definitely higher than in the UK and Australia. But when we looked specifically at the UK and Australia, again, it shows that the UK has slightly higher levels of trust in politicians and political parties. And again, keep in mind that this is pre-pandemic times. And then the last part of the data that I looked at was kind of the well-being measures. So the first one was the subjective general health. And when we look at the subjective general health, again, this data was collected on a scale from very good to very bad, like how people thought that their health was nowadays. And the Australian data, although in this slide it doesn't look like that, if you look at the independent t-test, it shows that the Australian data shows that the Australians have slightly higher, better health than the UK, or they perceive their health to be slightly better. But if we look here, you can see that definitely Denmark has much better health, kind of subjective general health. So we would think that, since the Australians have a better impression of their own health, they would possibly be happier or more satisfied with their lives. But what our data shows is that the UK actually shows slightly higher levels of life satisfaction and happiness nowadays. So this is just kind of a little bit of a snapshot of the data that we have and how we can compare it with different countries. And as you've heard today, it's interesting. Julie was mentioning that it would be nice to look at this data, compare data with other European countries, and we have this data available on the ESS. So in these slides, I looked at the happiness and life satisfaction in Serbia and Portugal as compared to ESS and the UK and Australia. But of course, we can do a lot more with this data and compare it with different kind of parts of Europe, like the southern countries, the eastern countries, and so on. And just to end my presentation today, there is a lot of potential for research and analysis between Australia and the ESS countries. I think it's really interesting that the slides that we've seen today from our presenters show the potential of this data and how much we can do with it. I only looked at some comparisons between our data, between the data collected in Australia and the ESS in general in some specific countries, just to show that, although Australia and the UK are sometimes regarded as being very similar from a cultural point of view, as we've seen today, there are quite a few things that are different. Like there's quite a lot of differences. Some societal attitudes are definitely different between the two contexts. But there's also more potential in this data, more that we can do looking at like other countries and compare them with Australia. So we look forward to further collaborations between the ESS and Life in Australia. Very happy to hear that you'll be fielding more of these questions. And we look forward to the potential that this brings to our research. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ruxandra. Are there any questions that anyone wants to raise with Ruxandra? No questions coming up. Thank you very much, Ruxandra, for your presentation. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I don't know, Ben and Nick, if you know how many people have accessed the linked data set yet. Is that something that you have figures on, or something maybe we can find out for the future?
Yeah, I do. I just looked just before this session. So it depends on how you
Great.
measure it. So we have quite detailed information, the ADA. So we have 174 people who looked at the data and downloaded something. And in terms of data downloads, actually not that many. So depending on the data that they've downloaded, I think it's about 7. We have diff per data set. So with Stata, it's about 7. SPSS, it's about 7. So it's still a resource that is a little largely untapped. And so for those aspiring PhD students out there who want to do comparisons, go ahead.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, we're so really keen for people to have access and use the data, and welcome any inquiries about it, and certainly you can talk to Rory and Ruxandra as well about using the data in cross-national comparisons as well. I might add also that I think there's some potentially exciting cross-national comparisons in linking the Oxford Tracker data as well. When you start doing your COVID, you're currently doing your COVID sets of questions, and I think it'll be really quite useful and important. And the nice thing about that data is that an 80 is an 80 in the UK, an 80 in Australia. It's designed to be equivalent, which is nice.
Yeah. How easy is it, Ben, to link
Rory,
that to?
Before you go on, I just want to add very quickly that the single ESS has, so Ben was talking about the single ESS, but the longitudinal data where we link some of our ESS measures has been downloaded a lot more, and we use that for our teaching as well. So it's one of our kind of core data sets which we use for our kind of social research methods and econometrics teaching.
Yeah, in terms of linkability, it's available on GitHub, free. You can link it. The main challenge is really to link the date that you want to the date of the interview or the timing of when the survey was collected. So, and that's where you get a lot of the power from variation over time within a particular wave.
Well, it's something interesting for our data archive to have a think about. I think I see someone from our data archive in the audience, so maybe that's something we could look at in the future. Thanks to everyone for attending today. It's been a really, really interesting session. I'm glad we've had it, as Nick noted, with the pandemic kind of sort of threw everything out of sync really with this. It was something we were planning, and then the pandemic came along, and we had lots of other things to think about for some time. So it's great we've had today. I'm really grateful to everyone for attending.